Welcome to this presentation by the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa. Today we'll talk about battery electric storage systems. Several of these systems are being proposed for different locations in Ontario, and today we'd like to discuss those and hopefully give you a good understanding of why these are important for us in Ontario. So first, this is an overview of what we'll discuss. So we'll talk about who EVCO is and why we're doing this presentation. We'll talk about the electrical grid, how it works, to give you an understanding of the role that the battery electric storage systems have. We'll talk about what they are. We'll talk about battery chemistry, and then we'll go on to economics. So, why would we deploy these things? What are the money implications? Then we'll talk about why now? Why haven't we been doing this for decades? We'll talk also about battery recycling and some of the community benefits that we'll get with these systems. So first, EVCO is, we've been around for 40 years. We're a nonprofit that's volunteer based. We're independent. That means that we don't accept funding. Actually, we refuse funding from interests that are part of the ecosystem for EV batteries or EV vehicles themselves. So we are independent. We've developed quite an expertise in EV batteries and the grid because a lot of people ask us questions about what are the impacts of EVs on the grid. So we'll be able to talk about that as we go through the presentation. And so why is that important that we know the EV batteries so well? Well, the batteries being proposed for these installations are actually the same batteries that are using EVs, so the same things apply. So if you look at the electrical grid, one of the things to to know about the electrical grid is that supply and demand must be closely balanced. That means that if demand increases for some reason, there's got to be some supply that's put into the grid to match that. If demand and supply are not closely balanced, what will happen is we'll have brownouts, or we'll have surges of current where the voltage will increase and it will cause some problems with the devices connected to the grid. Now, demand is variable. You see on the left-hand side, that is the demand that was recorded in October a few years ago, and for a few days in October. The dotted line is what was predicted to be the demand for Ontario, and the full line is the actual demand that was experienced for that same time in Ontario again. So you can see that the demand is quite variable, and you can see that during the night we have those dips in demand, where you can imagine that if we could produce electricity at low cost, then we might be able to use that electricity to shave the peak, so to make the peaks lower. So essentially that's what we are trying to do with these devices. So this variability in the demand causes prices of electricity to vary. So when demand is high, the price is high. When demand is low, the price is low. So in Ontario, we have excess capacity of production in the electricity system at night. So we have excess wind, and in many cases we curtail wind production because there's nothing to do with the electricity. We already have enough. And we also have some hydro where we can't keep the water. We have to let it run over dams without producing electricity. So both those sources are sources of essentially free electricity that we could be using if we had some way of storing the energy. So the overall supply is quite variable. So hydro, we get more hydro in the spring because there's more water. Solar and wind, obviously, when it's sunny and when it's windy, that's when they will produce. So the supply doesn't necessarily match the demand. So we need to bridge that gap, right? The other thing that will cause supply to vary is maintenance. So what the producers will do is they'll do periodic maintenance. Typically, they try to do that during the low periods, which is the spring and the fall, so that they don't affect their ability to supply electricity when we have higher demand. So we need to bridge the gap, and this is commonly referred to as peak shaving. So we want that peak to be as low as possible because having a higher peak means higher cross electricity. So the OEB has introduced, the Ontario Energy Board has introduced the time of use rates and ultra low overnight rates to consumers in Ontario. So those are designed to encourage people to move their demand from high demand periods to low demand periods. So, for example, if you're charging your EV, the rates encourage you to charge your EV at night when demand is low and electricity prices are cheaper, so that there's less of a peak during the day. So what's a battery electric storage system? Well, you see an illustration on the right here, and this is an unfinished installation. I'm not sure where, but that's what they look like. It's a bunch of enclosures that have batteries in them. There's transformers and there's distribution lines and all that. So it's a typical electrical installation. So these are commonly deployed around the world. So if you look at Tesla alone, they sell $6 billion of these types of batteries per year. So you can imagine that means that there are a lot of other installations throughout the world, and the rate of deployment of these installations is increasing rapidly. So they currently use lithium-ion batteries to store the energy. And again, these are the same type of batteries as what you would use in an electric vehicle. Right now, they represent about 50%. So LFP, we'll talk about battery chemistry in the next slides, but the LFP, excuse me, chemistry represents about 50% of the market share for electric vehicles. The market share is growing. The reason the market share is growing is because the low cost of materials means that LFP batteries are less expensive than the other chemistries. The one disadvantage with LFP batteries is that the density, energy density is lower, which means that for the same amount of electricity, the battery will be heavier. So if you're moving the battery, that's an issue. But if you're not, as you would be in these installations, it's less of an issue that there are heavier batteries. So let's move on to battery chemistry. So the first one we'll discuss is NMC, and here I'm going to oversimplify things a bit. There are different types of NMC batteries, but essentially those batteries contain various levels of nickel and cobalt. Nickel and cobalt are expensive materials, so that means the batteries are expensive. And however, though, they provide us the highest energy density. So currently, the highest energy density, so the most energy per weight of battery, is obtained with NMC batteries. So that's why they've been used in the past and are still popular today. The Tesla Powerwall in particular, which is designed to be installed in either basements or garages in residential homes, is using NMC batteries still today. All portable devices, I say all here, there would be some exceptions, but typically all portable devices would be using NMC chemistry. So if you're thinking about your smartphone, your tablet, the laptop, all of those have NMC chemistry, and the reason for that is that everybody wants their battery to last as long as possible. Everybody wants their device to be as light as possible. So that's why we use NMC chemistry at this point in time. That may change in the future, though. NMC chemistry has the disadvantage that it's more prone to fire if the enclosure is breached. Okay, so what that means is if the battery, if you drill through it or something happens during an accident or there's a manufacturing defect, the battery could catch fire in some cases spontaneously with exposure to air. So this is a bit of a concern. There haven't been that many fires in electric vehicles or storage systems. Where we see fires is with devices like hoverboards, e-scooters, etc. That tend to use very low quality batteries, and those are more prone to fires because they're low quality batteries. But if you look at the batteries that are in EVs and storage systems, the makers of those batteries want the batteries to last very long. So in the case of EVs, the warranty is typically 8 years, 160,000 kilometers. So for the battery to last that long, it has to be a high quality battery, and those high quality batteries tend to be much less subject to fire than the ones in the cheap devices. If you look at the next battery chemistry, so LFP, lithium iron phosphate, this is what is expected to be used in these storage systems. So So the reasons for that is that they have no nickel and cobalt, so that means the raw materials are much more abundant, but also much less expensive than they are for NMC batteries. So lithium iron phosphate are all elements that are quite common and less expensive. So that means that the cost of the battery is lower. So that is driving adoption. That's why we're seeing an increasing share of the EV market being using LFP batteries. They also have the advantage of lasting longer, so they're less expensive and they last longer. That's a pretty good deal. They're also much less prone to fire, so they don't have the similar problem as what the NMC batteries, where they will spontaneously catch on fire with exposure to air. In some cases, LFP batteries are a lot more stable and are much less prone to fire. Now, the one disadvantage with the LFP batteries, which I mentioned before, is that they have a lower energy density. But since here we're talking about a static storage, this is not an issue. So you transport the battery once, it's there. You don't have to move it around and use energy to move it around, so it's less of a problem, right? There are some other chemistries that are coming down the pipe over time. So in particular, there are sodium-based batteries. And the reason that sodium-based batteries are being explored is that you can imagine the sodium is much less expensive and much more abundant than lithium. So this will allow us to scale battery production to essentially very, very high levels without fear of running out of raw materials. The disadvantage, though, is that they don't have as high an energy density as LFP batteries. That will change over time, and we're already seeing some cars in China that have sodium-based batteries in them. So it's just a matter of time before that spreads to other vehicles. So let's talk about the economics, because why would a promoter want to do this, install these batteries? Well, it's a question of economics. So if you look at the demand curve that I showed earlier, the last kilowatt hour that's produced is the most expensive one, and that's in part because we have a significant amount of capacity that's in place just in case we need to meet peak demand. So this capacity has to be there all the time, just waiting for the few times where the peak goes very high. So there's lots of the capacity is idle. More than 90% of the time, there's actually some installations that are only used a few hours a year. So if you imagine, if you're using a facility for a few hours a year, the overall cost of electricity from that facility is quite high. So and that could go into the dollars per kilowatt hour. So the other thing is that Ontario has an overproduction, and at night, right, with hydro and wind, and in some cases, actually, the overproduction is sold at a loss. So we actually we pay people when there's negative prices. We pay people to take the excess energy that we have, because the energy has to go somewhere. There has to be a balance between supply and demand. If there's not enough demand, we need to get the electricity to go somewhere. So we actually pay people to take our electricity at some times of the year. So there's an overproduction. Currently, hydro dams, if there's not enough electricity demand, what they'll do is they'll spill water over the dam overnight, and that water could have otherwise been used to produce electricity. And there's also wind that's being curtailed. So again, when there's not enough demand and there's plenty of production, what they'll do is they'll stop producing electricity with the windmills. And both of those sources are sources of electricity that's very, very inexpensive, because you could use the water to produce electricity at no extra cost, and you could spin the windmill to produce electricity at essentially no marginal cost. So the idea here is to take that very cheap energy that's being otherwise wasted and store it into a battery, where we could use the capacity of the battery to do peak shaving. So what we would do is fill the batteries at night when demand is low, and then take that energy and pump it back into the grid when demand is high, to balance out the grid. Okay, so the resulting net effect is that the cost of the energy on the grid is lower, which means that the electricity prices are lower. So that's one of the big benefits for consumers in Ontario of having these facilities, is the electricity prices will be lower. So why are we doing that now? Why didn't we do this years ago? Well, in fact, there are two different schemes that are used currently in Ontario for the equivalent of batteries. One is hydro reservoirs. So if you have a hydro dam and you don't need the electricity right away, well, you could keep the water up to a certain point behind the dam and use that more or less as a battery. Now, there's limits to how much you could do there, and that's why in Ontario we spill some of the water over dams overnight. There's the other possibility is pump storage, and what pump storage does is, as you see on the right hand side there, is you have a reservoir that's up a hill and another one that's at the bottom of the hill. When you want to produce electricity, the water flows from the top to the bottom, spins the turbines, produces electricity. When there's excess electricity in the grid, you do the opposite. You take the water from the bottom reservoir, pump it back to the top, and the efficiency, overall efficiency of these types of installations is around 80%. So it's a good way of storing energy essentially with water. Okay. So the economics have changed, and right now, what we've seen over the last, well, actually over 10 years, is that lithium-ion battery prices have declined by over 90%. So that means that these batteries are now sufficiently inexpensive to make them economically viable. So we could deploy these batteries, and because we're using cheaper electricity and re-putting it in the grid when prices are higher, the differential allows us to make money on these types of installations. So again, the demand and supply is highly variable. And today, wind and solar are the least expensive ways to produce electricity. So we're expecting to see more wind and solar being deployed, not just in Ontario, but throughout the world, as they are the cheapest way of producing electricity. Now, because they're intermittent, we need to store the electricity somewhere. Some of it can be consumed as we produce it, but some of it needs to be stored in some device, including these batteries. And another point is that lithium-ion batteries have some other advantages from a grid perspective. So they're able to respond very fast to changes in demand, and that is very useful for the grid to be able to keep it balanced between demand and supply. So we've had lots of questions about battery recycling, so let's cover that in this slide. So if you look at the cars that you have today, so if you're driving an internal combustion engine car, so gas or diesel car, that vehicle will have lead acid batteries. And it turns out that the recycling rate for those batteries is around 99% according to the EPA in the US, and that's pretty well the same thing throughout the world. So the batteries, lead acid batteries, they don't have very valuable material. Lead is not that expensive, and the acid there is not that expensive either. So regardless of the low expense, we're seeing very, very high levels of recycling. So we're expecting something similar with EV batteries and also batteries from these facilities, right? So lithium-ion batteries, they contain a lot of much more valuable materials than lead acid, and we expect the batteries to last on the order of 20 years. So after 20 or more years, the batteries will be recycled, and they will likely bring another enclosure with the batteries already in there and just replace it. So, but what's taken away will be recycled. Right now, the volume of batteries for recycling is still low because EV batteries last a long time. There are some batteries from devices like smartphones and laptops and all that are being recycled today, but the supply is quite low because those are relatively small batteries. Now, who's recycling now? There are two cases here that I'm illustrating. So there's a company called Li-Cycle that's based in Toronto, and it's one of the biggest recycling companies on the planet, and they've got installations in various countries, including here in Canada in Kingston, and they recycle all sorts of lithium-ion batteries. The other company here, the highlight is Redwood Materials. They're a company that's recycling the excuse me, the manufacturing rejects from Tesla. So Redwood Materials has been in business for a while, and what they do is recycle those batteries, and the material goes straight into making other batteries. So You might wonder, what are the community benefits? Why would you want these devices or these installations to be in your community? Well, there's a number of different benefits that will accrue to the community. The first one is employment. So, particularly during the construction of these devices, these installations, their construction workers will be employed to put them into place. And again, that's mostly during the construction phase of the project. The next benefit is municipal tax revenue. So these devices will and installations will pay municipal taxes, and that will increase the tax base for the municipality. It will contribute to lower electricity prices. So like I said before, we're taking inexpensive electricity from the nighttime and using it during the day. So we get a benefit there where electricity prices will be lower than they would be otherwise. We get cleaner air and cleaner electricity. The reason for that is that the peak shaving done with the battery electric storage systems avoids running gas plants. So our peaker plants, as we call them in Ontario, that are used for very high peak demand, are generally gas plants, and of course they consume methane, which creates greenhouse gases and other health-affecting pollutants. So by having these systems, we avoid some of those gas plants operating. It gives us a more resilient grid. So there's something called a concept called distributed energy resources. These batteries are part of that. So the idea there is that you distribute the resources throughout the grid so that you're less dependent on large transmission systems to transmit from, say, a centralized plant in Darlington to Ottawa. So instead, what you do is you keep the energy more local, and you need if there is an outage somewhere, you're less prone to be affected by the outage. It also means less transmission lines. So if you think about the growing demand in a city like Ottawa, what's happening over time is that the transmission lines that are coming from the large centralized production facilities, they have a fixed capacity. So at some point, we'll need to deploy more transmission lines, or we could use the excess capacity in the transmission lines that are there at night to transmit that energy to somewhere closer to Ottawa, store it closer to Ottawa, and then distribute it in Ottawa. So that way you have less transmission lines that are required. Transmission lines are somewhat unsightly, but also they're quite expensive to build and operate. So if we could avoid building transmission lines, that will again contribute to lowering the price of electricity. Okay. The other thing that can happen is these promoters, of course, they want to work with the community because they're hosting these. The communities are hosting these facilities, and there's a possibility of them providing you direct community contributions for various projects that you'd like to do in your community. So other things that I want to talk about. So at one of the public sessions we've had before, there's someone who talked about the fact that lithium reacts violently with water and actually essentially explodes. That is true for elemental lithium. So if you take pure lithium and you throw it in water, you'll get a really nice a really nice show. But the batteries, they don't use elemental lithium. They use compounds of lithium. So these are not explosive in any way. Whether they're in contact with water or not, they're not explosive. So the analogy to that is, if you look at hydrogen, hydrogen is explosive when it's in the presence of oxygen. You may have seen the Hindenburg blow up a while ago. That's because hydrogen is explosive. Just a small spark in the presence of oxygen, and it will actually combust. Now, hydrogen is one of the components of water, and water is not explosive, right? So it's the same principle where the molecules that you're producing of water have very different properties from the original molecules, which are hydrogen and oxygen, right? So compounds have very different properties, no risk of explosion. Okay. One other thing to mention is that every change has winners and losers. So there are there are some actors out there that are trying to prevent these types of installations from being deployed. And as I said earlier, these devices will allow us to avoid burning some fossil gas. And the sellers of those fossil gases have a disincentive for these to be deployed. So some of them are fighting and trying to encourage the public to oppose these facilities because they will lose market share if these facilities are deployed. So let's talk about the risks. Every technology has some risks, and it's important for people to understand the risk and important to ask questions about the risk. But let's go over them. So fire risk is the thing that seems to come up the most often. So we can never say never. However, the batteries that will be used for these installations are LFP batteries, and as I've discussed previously, they're much less prone to fires than NMC batteries. If you've seen an installation like this with a fire, there was an instance in Australia a number of years ago with a Tesla installation, and those batteries were actually NMC. And since then, designs have been changed to take advantage of the lessons learned and to reduce the chance of fire spreading. Another thing to note is that the Powerwall, again, the Tesla Powerwall, uses NMC batteries, and these are installed in multiple basements and garages throughout the world. So they're a popular option for at-home storage for people who have solar and the like, and they're commonly used, and they don't really pose a significant fire risk. One thing to note is if you start comparing the risk of these installations with other installations you see commonly in your communities, gas stations would actually be much riskier from a number of perspectives. So their gas bills, either the tanks leaking or actually more frequently when people fill their car with gas or diesel, there will often be a bit of spillage, and that spillage will seep into the ground and potentially contaminate the groundwater. So there's nothing like that with batteries. Also, the fire risk, given that gas and diesel are quite flammable, mostly gas. Diesel is a bit less flammable. The fire risk is much higher with a gas station. So hopefully this answers many of the questions you would have. And if you're looking to reach us because you've got some other questions, you could either go to our website at fco.ca, or you could send an email at info@fco.ca, and we'd be pleased to respond to you. Thanks a lot.